So I'm just going to run through basically how we would use this model to depict a blocking situation. So again, just to recover this base, this is what we're talking about in terms of basic preparation. So if we're going to do a full-blown blocking study here, we've got two groups, our experimental group, this being the one that's going to show us blocking, and then control group, and two phases. So now we're not going to have to model each and every bit of every phase, as you'll see. We'll take a few logical shortcuts here. But again, in phase one, our experimental group gets one of the CS's paired with the US, presumably until that association is asymptotic. And then in phase two, both groups start getting the compound CS, CSA and CSB, paired with the US. And again, the basic idea is that while our control group, once we get to phase two, will now start learning about both associations, CSA US and CSB US, our experimental group will never learn to associate CSB with the US. That association will be blocked, and we talked about why that would be the case in terms of contingency. If you already have a perfect predictor of shock, what benefit is there to you to learn another perfect predictor of shock? Well, one of the little wrinkles you have to deal with if you're going to model blocking is because when we get to the second phase of a blocking study, we're dealing with a compound CS. Two CS's presented together leading to the US. Now, we're dealing with compound stimulant model. There's no way to model a compound stimulus all at once. So we're going to have to break it down into the two separate CS's, model what happens with regard to each CS, and then, as we'll get to, then we have to do a little bit of adding things up at the end to make sure we kind of stay on track. So when we start phase two of modeling, for example, when we talk about our control group, we're going to have to model first, what's delta V for the CSA US association, and then we're going to have to model what's delta V for the CSB US association. And then, as I'll show you in the actual numbers in a second, we're going to have to add up both of those delta V's because they're both coming off of the same US. The same US is powering both associations. So when we get to the second trial, we're going to have to add up all the learning that's been used up by either CS before we start modeling the second trial. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, well, hopefully it will shortly. So we're not going to bother doing any modeling for phase one. There's really no point. We can just sort of assume that in our experimental group, we ran those phase one trials until that association hit asymptotic. It was as strong as it was going to get. Now, as we talked about with regards to this model, there is that sort of Zeno's paradox element to it, that if we just kept calculating trial after trial after trial, we'd never actually get to the point where V sub t was exactly equal to lambda. It would just keep getting microscopically closer and closer. So this is a little bit of a fudge, but I think it's a justifiable fudge. That we're just going to assume that in the first phase for our experimental group, we used up all the available associative strength. That first association. So we're going to kind of assume that we got V sub t all the way up so it's actually equal to lambda, just to make things relatively simple. So we're just going to have to start plugging numbers into the model when we get to phase two. So there's no a priori reason why I have to pick certain values here as long as I'm working within the limits. So I'm going to just decide to keep things as simple as I can here. I'm going to say that CSA and CSB are equally salient. So the light and the tone equal in terms of salience. And the shock, well, I'm just going to assign that a beta value of 0.5 and use alpha values of 0.2 for both of my CS's. And other than my decision that both CS's were equally salient, there's nothing else really governing what numbers I pick here. I could have picked 0.7 for both CS's. I could have picked 0.2 for beta. It really wouldn't matter. And I'm just going to arbitrarily pick a lambda value of 100. So here, again, we're going to model it as if both CS's were equally salient. Now, if they were not equally salient, that would not cause us a huge problem. What I'm going to sort of go through first is just modeling a couple trials of the control group. And that would look a little bit different if we use CS's of different salience, because we'd see the two CS's acquiring strength at different rates. But the overall point of the demonstration of blocking would not be affected by that. So we look at the first phase 2 trial, and again, this should look pretty much the same as the kind of acquisition stuff we ran through last week, with one little exception, one little thing we have to add to the procedure here because of the compound CS. So we plug the numbers in there, and for a control group, they end up acquiring 10 units of associative strength to CSA. So again, we're just modeling, let's say, the light here. So the light in the control group requires 10 units on the first trial, and then we got to model the second CS separately. So how much associative strength is CSB going to acquire? Well, given that the values for the two CS's are the same, somewhat unsurprising. I hope you're not surprised by this. The math works out exactly the same. So two equally salient CS's, they're going to be learned about at an equal rate, and your math should probably reflect that. So both CS's acquire 10 units of associative strength on the first trial. Now, well, just to make sure we're on the right page here, what was B sub t before this trial started? For either CS? 0, right? I mean, they hadn't learned anything. This is the control group. They had nothing done to them in phase 1. So this is where conditioning starts for them. So we're starting from a situation where they don't know anything about either CS in terms of an association. So we got 10 units acquired by each CS. Now here's where you got to remember to add things together. So that means out of that 100 units of associative strength that this US will support, we've used up 20 of them in total, 10 for each CS. So again, depending on the particular question you're being asked, you need to be careful about your arithmetic here to some extent. If I was to ask you, like, how many units of associative strength has CSB acquired after 3 conditioning trials, well, you'd have to do all the modeling and figure that out. If I asked you, what is, V sub t after 3 conditioning trials, that might involve some slightly different math because you'd have to add up the accumulated associative strength from both of the stimuli. Now, so again, we get to our second trial. Again, we still have to model them separately, but we have to take into account the total amount of that lambda value that's been used up. So here, even though this CS only acquired 10 units of associative strength, V sub t also includes the associative strength acquired by the other CS, so we plug 20 in there. I'm hoping that's not confusing the hell out of anybody. So we do our arithmetic here. Yes, ma'am?
You may have already said it, but so why didn't we go for that in build 1 for BT?
Okay, well, because what we're doing here for these subjects, right, is like if you're my little rat here, the light's coming on and the tone is sounding at the same time, and then you get a shock, right? So there's only one shock. There's only one US here. There's 2 CS's. So there's only one US. It only has that amount of power to support learning. And both CS's are using that up. And they're kind of working in parallel. So if you're talking about how much strength has been acquired by this CS or that CS, then you sort of look at the individual numbers. But when it comes to, so how much of that learning is left that this US could support, you've got to take into account what's been learned by both of the CS associations. So CSA acquired 10 units, CSB acquired 10 units in the first trial, so that's a total of 20 of that 100 units that's been used up already. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's why we're taking 20 away. So now there's 80 units possible left to learn. And again, the math's going to work out the same for both CSs. And they're both going to acquire a further 8 units of associative strength on the second trial. And this will, I'm not sure I can model a third trial here. What would V sub T be? Going the wrong direction. 36, that sounds reasonable, right? So each used up 10 units on the first trial, each used up 8 more, so that's a total of 36 units have been used up so far. So if we're going to model a third trial, you'd be plugging, whatever 100 minus 36, 64, 64 units of associative strength left that you can work with. So, and again, that's other than having to keep track and make sure you sort of add up the total results to figure out what V sub T is for the next trial. That's pretty much the same thing as just modeling basic acquisition. There's nothing too puzzling there, I'm hoping. And that pattern is just going to continue. I mean, just like in acquisition, the values for delta V are just going to keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you use up more of that available strength. And eventually, they'll start to get microscopically close to the value of lambda in total, and the delta V's will start getting very small. And at that point, we probably say, okay, well, we've kind of hit asymptote for both associations. Now, logically speaking, how many units of associative strength would be acquired at asymptote by the light in the control group? Light and tone are equally salient, right? So 50, right? There's 100 possible units of associative strength here. You got 2 equally salient stimuli, so they're going to get the same amount on each trial. So if you continued until all of that associative strength that was available had been used up, and there's 100 units of it, then both CSs would have acquired 50 of those units. Make sense? Now, we come to modeling the experimental group. Well, things are a little bit different because here we're dealing with a situation where some important stuff took place in phase 1. So same parameter values here. When we plug in, we look at, and we have to model the 2 CSs separately, but it's going to turn out to be something we're only going to have to do once here to make a point. As I said, we're assuming that we ran that CSA-US association in phase 1 until we hit asymptote, which means we used up all 100 units of associative strength on that association between the light and the shock in phase 1. So the amount of learning that's already been acquired here is all of it. All right? I mean, we've already acquired all the available associative strength that that US can support with that CSA-US association in phase 1. So, again, for the mathematically challenged amongst you, you start multiplying things by 0, it always ends up in the same place, doesn't it? It ends up as 0. And the same thing is going to be true for the second CS, for the same reason. All the available associative strength has been used up. So, on the first phase 2 trial, the experimental group, delta V for both CSs is 0. Neither CS acquires any associative strength on this trial. Now, what you have to keep in mind here is that one of these CSs already has all the associative strength. So, if I was to, at this point ask you, okay, so, how many units of associative strength have been acquired by CSB? Well, this is the first time this group's experienced CSB, and 0 units were acquired. how many units of strength, of associative strength have been acquired by CSA? Zero were acquired on this trial, but how many units of associative strength does the CSA-US Association have now? 100, just like it did at the end of phase 1. And because we've already used up all the available associative strength, so our value that we plug in for V sub t is going to be equal to lambda, the delta V's are just going to keep coming out to be 0 no matter how many of these trials we model. It's never going to change. Yeah, don't forget that all 100 of those units of strength have presumably already been acquired by one of those CS's. That's why V sub t is equal to 100. Yeah?
And it's CSA acquired all the 100 units because of the salience, was it?
Because of the phase 1 conditioning. We ran phase 1 until, I mean,
It was acquired.
salience doesn't, I mean, it would affect how fast that went. But even with a very, low salient CS, by definition, we're going to run phase 1 until we hit asymptote.
Okay.
So however long that takes is going to be, affected by the salience of the CS, but however long that takes, that's where we say we're going. So however long that takes, we've used up all that associative strength. Now, what you saw there is there's no new learning to either CS in the experimental group. And as I said when we were talking about the phenomenon last week, it doesn't matter how many of these phase 2 trials you do. You can run these phase 2 trials until everybody starts dying of old age, and this situation's never going to change. If you've used up all the associative strength in phase 1, you're just going to keep getting 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, no matter how many times you do this. Nothing's ever going to change. Which reflects pretty clearly the fact that the CSB association is going to be completely blocked. You're never going to learn anything about that. Now, one little wrinkle here that I'll run through briefly. When you're modeling partial blocking, well, you tell me, how are we going to do it differently if we want to use this model to represent partial blocking? What would we change from the way I just described it to you? How is partial blocking different from the regular old full blocking? Yes, ma'am?
You don't reach asymptote.
Right, so we have stopped the phase 1 training at some time before we hit asymptote, so there's still some associative strength left. So it's not going to be that hard to incorporate that idea into the model. So just for sake of example, I'm just taking this number out of thin air here. Let's say, we're going to keep the parameters the same, I think, for the most part. Let's just say of that 100 units of possible associative strength, we used up 70 of them in phase 1 for our experimental. So they've acquired, reasonably strong association between CSA and the US, but there's still some possible power left there that we might use for other things. Now, I'm not going to go through the control group again because they would look just the same as they did last time. Right? Nothing happened to them in phase 1, so they would just be starting fresh with the compound stimuli, and it would look exactly like I showed you before. They both would acquire 10 units on the first trial and 8 more on the second trial, and so on. The experimental group is going to look a little different. You can probably, if the math is making sense to you at any level here, you can probably see where this is going to go. So now the value for V sub t we're going to have to stick in here would be 70, because that's how much of the associative strength we used up in phase 1. And so we crunch our numbers there, and we end up deciding that CSA requires a further 3 units of associative strength. And in this case, because the blocking is only partial, CSB is going to also acquire 3 units of associative strength. So at this point, well, a couple of questions. What value for B sub t are we going to put in for our next trial that we model here?
Oh,
76 sounds reasonable to me, right? We used up 70 in the first phase just because I said so, and we just used up another 3 units on each CS here, so 76 in total have been used up. Slightly different question. How many units of associative strength does the CSA US Association have now? How many did it have at the end of phase 1? Yeah, it had 70 at the end of phase 1. It just got another 3 units here. So there's 73 units of associative strength powering that, light shock association. How many total units of associative strength have been acquired by the tone here at this point? 3, right? Tone never appeared in phase 1. So we've now used up, there's our 76 units we've used up, right? 73 have been used up by CSA, and another 3 have been used up by CSB. So just in case this is mysterious, this is my little invented shorthand. I can't do a subscript here for various reasons. But the amount of associative strength acquired by CSA is 73 units, and the amount acquired by CSB is 3 units for a total of 76 that's been used up. Model the second trial. Well, again, I don't think this is going to be too surprising. As we already decided, our value for V sub t, the amount of that 100 units that's been used up in total now is 76. And we get another 2.4 units of associative strength acquired by each CS. So, I could ask you, but I think you probably figured it out by now, or you're never going to figure it out. We now have 75.4 units of associative strength in total acquired by CSA, and presumably 5.4 units acquired by CSB, for a total of 80.8 that have been used up. And we could keep going like this, and again, we're just gonna keep using up more and more and getting very fractionally close to the value of lambda without ever actually getting there due to the paradoxical nature of the arithmetic here. So anything in there that puzzles anybody that I need to make more clear? So, if I was to ask you this, or to specifically, point out how this is, how have you demonstrated partial blocking here? Well, I didn't redo the control group trials, which you might have to do if this was a question you were faced with. But if you go, look back at the slide, a few slides back, when we modeled those control groups trials, each CS had acquired 18 units after 2 trials. Right? Both CSs got 10 units on the first trial, and then both got a further 8 on the second trial. So that means for the tone shock association, in our control group, that acquired 18 units of associative strength in the first 2 trials. And if we just look at the first 2 trials we just did for our experimental group here, in the partial blocking situation, acquired a total of 5.4 units, which is less than 18, which is our demonstration that that CSB association has been partially blocked in our experimental group. It's not acquiring strength at the same rate as it is in the control group. There's a bunch of other things that we could model, and I'm probably not going to go through them unless somebody really wants me to. I'm guessing nobody But let me ask you that. What would you do with this model to model unblocking? How would you have to approach that?
You end up being a negative number, a negative delta.
No, not in unblocking. I mean, well, if you think back, how would, in real world terms, how would we do unblocking? How would we make that happen? How would we have to run that little study?
Decrease the intensity
Of what?
of the.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically, that's unblocking. I mean, if we did a regular blocking study, the way I've described it, and we get to the point where we demonstrate, look, it doesn't matter how many of these phase 2 trials we do, our second CS is acquiring no associative strength in our experimental group. But then, in an unblocking situation, what we're going to do at this point, having shown that one association has been blocked, we're going to increase the salience/intensity of the US, which in terms of the model would mean what? Possibly yes, but this is where the model gets a little bit shitty. That's not the main thing you would want to adjust in order to make the model work here. No. A more intense, greater magnitude US could support more learning, right? So you would want to increase your value for lambda. And again, don't get caught up in the mistake of trying to increase lambda by some amount that is proportional to how much the actual stimuli changed. You can try if you want to, it's not going to help you. All you got to do is pick a bigger value for lambda. And then start modeling trials, and you'll see however much, if you started out with a lambda value of 100, and you used all that up in your experimental group in your first phase 1 of a regular blocking demonstration, and then go to phase 2 and show that CSB isn't acquiring anything. And then you'd say, okay, so now we're going to increase the intensity of the US. We say, okay, so now lambda is going to be equal to 200. Well, you now got 100 more units of associative strength that could be acquired. And they're going to be acquired equally by both stimuli, if they're equally salient, which they have been in my examples so far. So, under those circumstances, if we then somehow magically ran those unblocking trials until we ran out of steam, what's the total associative strength going to be for the two stimuli? That's an easy question. Yeah.
100 each?
No.
Oh.
We're now dealing with a total of 200 units of associative strength that we have parceled out here, right? And they're not going to have 100 each. CSA acquired 100 units all by itself in phase 1. And then we eventually added an extra 100 units. And if our two CSs are equally salient, that extra 100 units is going to get divided up evenly between the two. So we're going to end up with 150 units of associative strength for CSA and 50 for CSB. Any of that particularly mysterious? Making some sense? All right, now, you could model overshadowing. That's there's an exercise for you. I'll let you worry about it. If you want to try using the model to figure out how to model overshadowing, feel free to send me your results on email, and I'll tell you if you're even close. Yeah, you have a question?
Oh, what you just said about 150, that was unblocking.
Yes.
Okay.
So if we think about, we start out with 100 units in a basic blocking demonstration, whatever our US is, we say that has 100 units of associative strength. When it comes to the unblocking part, we have to increase the intensity of that US. So we're now saying, okay, so now we're using a stronger US that will support 200 units of learning. Well, 100 units has already been used up, and the 100 units we added is going to get split evenly between the two equally salient CSs. So you're going to end up with, CSA having a total of 150 units, 100 from the very first phase of the blocking study, and then it's going to require 50 more once we increase the intensity of the CS. CSB, which would be totally blocked in phase 2, now that there's an extra 100 units available, CSB is going to require 50 of those extra 100 units too.
So because that was 50 now, it's not blocked.
Yes, because we unblocked it, right? That's unblocking by making the CS or the US more intense, providing a little bit more power that could support more learning. Now, I think it was you last week that asked a fairly pointed question, which I think was a legitimate one, which I think was something along the lines of, so what's the fucking point? What's the point of doing this dumb modeling shit? Well, here's a point. If you have a nice little model that you can play around with a pencil and a piece of paper, rather than having to spend millions of dollars building animal facilities or doing stuff like that, sometimes you can get lucky, and just by playing around with the ideas on a piece of paper, you might get some ideas for things that you have not actually seen out there in the real world yet. And that, in fact, happened pretty quickly with the Rescorla-Wagner model. People just playing around with the model, friends said, well, if we do this with the model, this suggests that in real life, this would happen. And nobody really knew whether that would happen or not, although I think they probably had a pretty good suspicion that it would. So, I'll sort of describe, here's the situation in fairly sort of non-technical terms. So, let's say you live a couple doors down the street from me, which I hope is not true, but we'll just pretend it is for the time being. And you occasionally find yourself a little bit short of money from time to time. You're willing to do the odd thing to earn some money. And one day you just happen to be wandering by my house, and I say, hey, I'll give you $20 to cut my lawn. It's not a very big lawn, we take very long. And you're like, yeah, all right, I'll use $20, and so you cut my lawn. I'll give you $20. And maybe a week later, I happen to see you wandering past, and I say, hey, you still broke? I'll give you $20 if you wash my car. All right, you use $20. You wash my car, you do a decent job, $20. And this sort of becomes, kind of a regular routine. Every once in a while, you need some money, I happen to be around, it's like, oh, all right, I'm gonna cut my grass. And you cut my grass, you give me $20. And a few days later, you come by, you wash my car, all right, give me $20. And then the day comes when you're feeling particularly ambitious. Which is very unlike you. You're not a very ambitious person. But you're feeling particularly ambitious on this day, so you come over and you cut my lawn and you wash my car. And I give you $20. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I'd be disappointed.
You're disappointed. Why would you be disappointed? It's $20.
You would expect to get $20 for each scenario.
Oh, you were expecting more. Oh, aren't you a greedy little bastard? Oh. Now, I think most of you would probably respond to a situation like that in pretty much the same way. Like, you've got all this experience. All these different times I cut your lawn, you gave me $20. All these different times I washed your car, you gave me $20. And now I've cut your lawn and washed your car, and you gave me $20. And I'm not happy about that. Now, this was something that the Rescorla-Wagner model predicted would happen in a conditioning situation. And the phenomenon is called over-expectation. And if we were going to sort of model this in conditioning terms, again, this was something the model predicted. Nobody had ever actually done this in a conditioning experiment, although, as you can probably recognize, this is a not particularly difficult principle to wrap your head around. most people would probably feel kind of ripped off in that situation, just like he did. So, say we've got two CSs, CSA, a light, CSB, a tone, and as almost always, I'm going to use a shock here as the US. So, again, for sake of argument, we're going to say our light and our tone are equally salient, so we're going to use the same value for alpha for both of them. And I'm just going to pick value for alpha for the shock, and I'm just going to pick 0.5 for all of them, for no particular reason. And I'm going to say lambda is equal to 100. 100 possible units of associative strength here that this US will support. Now, here, in phase 1, there's going to be, we're not going to present VCS as a compound. So there's going to be a mix of two types of trials for both our groups. On some trials, the light's going to come on, and you're going to get a shock. CSA, then followed by the US. On other trials, and presumably there's a 50-50 mix of these things, on other trials, the tone's going to come on and be followed by a shock. So this is basically, the equivalent of, him cutting my lawn, getting 20 bucks. Him washing my car, getting 20 bucks. Same US, but each CS is conditioned with it separately. And we'll run those phase 1 trials, mixing them up, one or the other kind, until both those associations seem to have hit asymptote. We've got them both about as far as they could possibly go, which would mean that, in theory, all our associative strength has been used up. Now, here things are going to be a little bit different than they were in the blocking situation, because in the blocking situation, we were presenting both CSs together as a compound. Here, we're presenting each CS individually with the US. So in this situation, both the light and the tone could acquire 100 units of associative strength. They could acquire all the associative strength that that US is capable of providing. So B sub T for the light would be equal to lambda equal to 100, and B sub T for the tone would be equal to lambda, which is equal to 100. So both associations have acquired 100 units of associative strength. And now, in the equivalent of having him, wash my car and mow my lawn and get 20 bucks, in phase 2, we're going to present the two CSs together as a compound for the first time. And we're just going to leave the control group alone. And then, after some number of phase 2 trials, we'll go back to the actual numbers in a second here. We present the light by itself to the subjects that went through our experimental group procedure, and we got a pretty small CR. We present the tone by itself. We got a pretty small CR. We look at our control group that we just left alone. We didn't give them any of the compound CS trials in phase 2. We get a relatively big conditional response to both CSs. So why is the response to each of these CSs significantly smaller in our experimental group? Well, it must be because of that compound CS training that they went through in phase 2. So, when we get to that second phase, with regards to our experimental group here, both the light and the tone have acquired the maximum associative strength that that US will support. Now, when we start putting them together, this is where we run into that over expectation. Just like when he did both jobs for me, he expected two $20s, but he only got one and wasn't happy about it. Are the subjects in our experimental group, when they get to those phase 2 trials, and all of a sudden, for the first time, they see the light and hear the tone at the same time, they're basically expecting 2 shocks, but they only get one. And this is going to act to reduce the strength of both of those associations. So again, now that we're doing a compound trial, if we're going to stick numbers in our model, we're going to have to do each CS separately. Yeah.
So we would measure that they're expecting both USs by the amount of, for example, in a shock, how active they are, or how much they're expecting it, or?
Probably some sort of suppression ratio is what we're going to be measuring here with an aversive US like that. So we'd have some kind of behavioral background that we could see them decreasing, and they would decrease their behavior by a fairly large magnitude. Now, I'm not sure you would actually see this reflected proportionally and clearly in their behavior, but yeah, their behavior would start to change. They would show you. I mean, if they at the end of phase 1, when they've been conditioned with each one of these things separately, I mean, you're probably going to hit what we call a floor effect here. In that, if the light comes on and they know the light means a shock and that scares them, they might very well just stop responding altogether, which means you're going to have a suppression ratio of 0, which means you scared the shit out of them. They stop doing anything. Now, that's kind of the limit. You can't go beyond that. I mean, you can't have them be do less than nothing. So when you present the two things as a compound, yeah, they're probably more scared than they were when you just presented one thing individually. But if they're already completely suppressing their behavior, you're not going to see that reflected in a further suppression at that point. But it will become evident if you sort of start following through with the math, or just keep modeling trials and looking at the strength of the CR that you're getting from your subjects. So after we did both CSA and CSB associations separately, they both acquired 100 units of associative strength. Yeah.
I see this happening mathematically, I mean, given
Yeah.
the equation. But unless it's some cognitive aspect in which, for example, being a rational being and associating by separate both stimulus with the response, it's really realistic to expect that an organism will associate that because it's twice, I mean, both of the stimulus are already or simultaneously applied, that the response will be twice the strength?
If you had, I mean, would you not expect the same thing that he did in that situation?
Yes, but that's what I'm saying. That there is a cognitive aspect that is at play there. With a more simpler organism or experiment, it would be expected to reflect the same, then the equation is the same?
I think it would. I mean, if I ran you through a whole bunch of conditioning trials where, a little light comes on and then you get punched in the face. And I do that until that's asymptotically conditioned. I mean, your response isn't getting any bigger no matter how many more trials we do. And I do a whole bunch of trials where a little tone comes on and you get punched in the face. Now, wouldn't it make sense that you might learn about both of those things sort of independently? Oh, lights mean you get punched in the face. Tones mean you get punched in the face. So you experience a light and a tone at the same time. Wouldn't you be expecting to get punched in the face twice? Or get like a double face punch or whatever that might happen to be? I would think you would. I mean, that seems pretty logical to me. even without any advanced sort of rational cognitive interpreting of the situation. So, at this point, with our experimental group, if we figure out, once we start presenting them as a compound and we start more, having to calculate some total amount of dissociative strength that's been acquired, each CS has already acquired 100 units. So we've got a total associative strength of 200 units here. Now, lambda is only equal to 100, because it's still the same shock that we've been using all along. Quite that fast. So, we created a situation here, like I created with him doing odd jobs for me, where the combined associative strength is greater than the US is capable of supporting. The combined amount of work he did for me is greater than the value of the $20 that I'm going to give him. Now, just to follow through with that analogy, let's say he's, well, we've already established he's generally probably pretty unemployable. So it's not like he's going to go out and get a good job or something. He still needs money. So he still wanders past my house every once in a while. And, I still try and get him to cut my lawn and wash my car. What do you think's going to happen? I mean, he could just say, fuck you, and just like keep walking and not do any work for me anymore. But assuming he does continue to, at least in some fashion, work for me, what would you expect to happen? He'll come over and he washes the car and cuts my lawn and I give him $20. And he comes over again and washes my car and cuts my lawn and I give him $20. He might, but let's say I don't give him the opportunity to do that. It's either you do both things or go away. He's going to start doing a shitty job of both those things, to some extent, right? He's not going to trim around the bushes. He's not going to, wipe the little bug spots off my headlights. He's just going to start doing a half-assed job because in his mind, he's thinking, all right, you want to only give me $20. I'm going to give you $10 worth of lawn mowing and $10 worth of car washing. Because that's what's going to add up to $20 worth of work from his perspective. Well, same kind of thing is going to go on here. We created a situation where our subjects are expecting a lot more US than they're actually going to get. The amount of learning that's been acquired is greater than the amount of learning that US can actually support. So, when we start doing these compound trials, both those CS's are going to start losing associative strength. And because we made both of them equally salient, it's going to go in nice sort of parallel fashion for both stimuli. And they're going to keep losing associative strength until the total of the two of them adds up to something that US is actually capable of supporting. Which in this case, they would both go from 100 units of associative strength down to 50. Because when they're both at 50, now that adds up to 100, which is what that US can actually support. That sort of makes sense? I'm hoping. All right. Now, yes, ma'am.
When you say that US can support, that's lambda, right?
Yes. So as I just sort of add up, so now, we're going to keep losing strength until the total of both stimuli's associative strengths equals lambda, which in this case is 100. So, and again, because they're equally salient, they're going to sort of move at the same rate until both of them have 50 units of associative strength. So we're going to lose associative strength for both associations. And this is probably, so again, go back to my example with our colleague here. He's eventually going to do shittier and shittier jobs at both these tasks until he gets to the point where he figures, okay, that feels like $10 worth of lawn mowing, And that feels like 10 bucks worth of car washing. All right, that's how much work I'm gonna do for 20 bucks. Now, if I wanted my lawn cut as nice as he did initially, and I wanted my car as clean as he got it initially, I'm probably gonna have to increase the intensity of the US here. So if I started paying him 40 bucks for doing both jobs, probably start seeing an increase in the quality of his work again. Unless he's in the union, and then he's just keep doing the shittiest job possible for the most money possible. Yes, sir.
And with regards to perhaps another example, like for with shock, for example, how would that look like? Because you're relating this to the amount of work you would put it, but for example, with the shock aspect, would that be a lesser response?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'd start to see, I mean, now, again, there might be some floor effects that we'd have to try and
Yeah.
avoid.
Not
here.
exactly, but.
But yes, we would start to see less suppression to each of the CSs as they sort of unlearned part of the individual associations during the compound conditioning training. Now, just to wrap, I want to talk for a few minutes about another model, which isn't going to involve any numbers or calculating or anything. It's just more of an idea-based model. But as I think this is what we finished up with last week. One fairly obvious problem with Rescorla-Wagner is the way it deals with extinction, which, as I think we determined, it deals with extinction as if it was the exact opposite of learning, as if it was unlearning, as if that association was in fact being completely erased. And we've talked at some length about all the evidence suggesting that that is not what really happens. There's a second, not quite so much of a problem as a shortcoming of Rescorla-Wagner. One of the other things we talked about a little bit earlier in the course is the effect of different temporal arrangements. Now, without presenting any great amount of data to try and convince you, I was telling you that like short delay conditioning will probably work better than backwards conditioning or simultaneous conditioning. The amount of time that occurs between the CS and the US being presented is relevant. The amount of time between one trial and the next becomes relevant in some situations. There's no way to work time into the Rescorla-Wagner model in any kind of sense at all. It treats all different temporal situations as if they were all exactly the same, which is another thing that we know for real world data is not true. Time matters in terms of conditioning and how well it works and how fast it works and so on. Now, what we call comparator models, and there's several different varieties of this kind of model. So I'm only going to talk about them sort of in general. I think Ralph Miller kind of came up with this idea. Now, it's a different sort of model than Rescorla-Wagner in a lot of ways. It's not the kind of thing we can do a sort of a trial-by-trial modeling the way we would with Rescorla-Wagner. And we're not actually going to do any of the math, although we could if we really wanted to, but I'm assuming nobody really wants to. But this is based on more sort of long-term, over the big picture, rates of occurrence or likelihoods of US's happening. Now, key idea behind these comparator models is that we've got our little subject in some sort of environment where we can present stimuli. And we present some CS, and then we deliver a shock as the US. Now, what the comparing models are going to say is that, first of all, the kind of association that we would expect to form here, the kind of thing we've been talking about so far, is gonna happen. We're gonna start to see an association forming, well, what we're gonna start to see, that's a bit of a different question, but an association is gonna form between the CS and the US. Between the little light coming on and the shock. However, there's also an association that's gonna form between what Miller referred to as the context and the shock, which isn't that hard an idea to wrap your head around, I don't think. I mean, if I put you in this special little chamber where a light comes on and you get a shock, yeah, it would be pretty reasonable to assume you're going to learn to associate that light with the shock. But would it not also be pretty reasonable to assume you're going to learn to associate being put in that little room with a shock? Now, because there are these two different associations forming, you can't necessarily know what the subject is learning or not learning by looking at their behavior. At least not as easily as you could take in other approaches. So our subjects learn in both associations. They're learning to associate the CS with the US and also learning to associate the context with the US. So, assuming that we're using novel stimuli, everything's new to our subject, so there's no previous associations to mess things up. They're going to be learning both of these associations, and here's where the behavior is not going to necessarily reflect what has been learned, because we do a bunch of these trials where I put you in a little chamber and the light comes on and you get a shock, and then I test you with the light. I'm probably going to see some response indicating you've learned something about it, but it's not going to be a particularly big response, or at least it could certainly get bigger. Now, how we could make that response start to increase to the CS, well, we're only going to be able to do that if the CS actually becomes a better predictor of shock than the context is.
How is not the context considered a stimulus?
How is it what?
Is that the context is not considered a stimuli by itself?
Well, I mean, you could call it a stimuli. It's a pretty big compound of stimuli. So there's all kinds of aspects of the context that you might notice or pick up on. So I'm just kind of lumping them all together and calling it the context.
Okay.
I mean, the chamber might have a particular smell, or particular colors, or particular shape, or particular kind of chair that you get to sit in. All these things might be cues that in a big compound, or what I'm sort of referring to together as the context. Now, well, how are we going to make the CS a better predictor than the context? Well, I think the answer should be pretty obvious. Well, we start extinguishing the context US association. Well, how would we do that? How is that going to, if we move to a different place, then what are we going to do in the different place?
Yeah, I had that thought before you asked the question. Now that you put it, yeah.
You have to reproduce the
Different
context.
approach.
You mean you have to reproduce the context, replicate the context.
I mean, if we're going to extinguish the context US association, how do we extinguish an association? Which would be, in this case,
Predicted the absence.
well, I meant more like, what are you going to do? How are you going to run an extinction trial? Yeah.
So we would put the animal, the rat, in the
sense, but it's not quite right. If you leave out the part about the light, if you're not trying to extinguish the CS-US association, you want to make that more powerful. So the last thing you want to do here is start presenting that light coming on when there's no shocks following. What you want to do is just put it in the context. Put your little rat in the chamber and just let it hang out in there with no lights coming on and no shocks being delivered. So now, that is how you would extinguish the context association. So because you're exposing it to the context over and over and over, and no US happens. So a basic sort of extinction procedure. Now, you could do it that way. Now, the example I'm going to give you in a minute, we'll take a slightly different approach, but the same idea. Now, even though after your initial training, let's just say for the sake of argument that the CS and the context were both equally good predictors of the shock. Now, I'm not saying how good a predictor either of them was. I'm just saying they were equally good. Well, now, if we extinguish the context-US association, the context is becoming a worse predictor. So we're degrading the value of the context as a predictor of shocks. So now, even though the CS-US association, it hasn't gotten any better, it's not any stronger, but we're going to see a bigger response to the CS. We're going to see the conditional response to our little light coming on increase. And note that we're going to see the response to the CS increase, even though there have been no more shocks delivered. Under any circumstances here. We just keep putting our rat, whatever we're using, back in the chamber, back in the context, where no shock is delivered and no CSs come on. And that's going to extinguish that context shock association eventually. So, basically, even if the light, the CS, was a relatively shitty predictor of shocks, it's now the best predictor you got. Because the other predictor you had of shocks, which was the context, we've started to degrade and extinguish that. So being in that context is now not a good predictor of shocks at all anymore. So even if the light is pretty crappy as a predictor, it's now the best one you got. So you're going to start responding more as we extinguish the context US association. Now, experimentally, it's a little bit easier to keep things straightforward. If we use, instead of just relying on the context, which, as has come up, can be a pretty complex stimulus, what if we use an explicit, fairly discrete CS in the place of that context? So here, I run a little experiment where in our first phase, there's going to be a couple of different types of trial. So on trial type 1, CSA, whatever that is going to lead to the US every time it happens. So we'll just call CSA the light. So the light comes on, you get a shock. The other type of trials we're going to mix in there are trials where our second CS is presented. The tone, CSB. Now, CSA, this is the one that, if you're sort of mapping this in your head, this is the one we're using to represent the context, or this is the equivalent of the context here. And CSB, that's the equivalent, that's the explicit CS. We're going to end up seeing the response to change. Now, in phase one here, if the light comes on, you get a shock every time. If the tone comes on, half the time you get a shock, half the time you don't. So this training, I mean, you're going to learn here that the light coming on, CSA being presented, is a pretty good predictor of the shock. The tone coming on is a relatively shitty predictor of the shock. It's only right half the time. And as you might expect, we do a bunch of that training and then we sort of test, well, what's your response to the tone? We're not going to get that much. We'll probably get some conditional response, but not a huge amount, because this is a pretty bad predictor. We get a much bigger response to CSA, our good predictor that's, right every time. Well, now, in phase two, we're just going to present CSA, and we're going to extinguish it. So the light comes on, and there's no shock. And the light comes on, and there's no shock. Light comes on, no shock. We're just doing extinction trials. Presenting that CS over and over by itself, with no US. Now, we're not presenting CSB, or the tone, at all here. And no shocks are being delivered here. I mean, we're just presenting that CSA over and over by itself. So CSB is never presented during these extinction trials. Oops, I'm going to do it further. And what we're going to find is the more of those CSA extinction trials we do, the bigger the response is going to get for CSB. We're going to start to see a bigger and bigger response to the tone. Now, Rescorla-Wagner could not deal with this. It would never predict this. This kind of violates some of the assumptions that Rescorla-Wagner is based on. How can you see a change in the response to a stimulus over a series of manipulations where that stimulus was never presented? Well, that's what we're seeing here. By extinguishing the really good predictor, CSB, which started out as a pretty shitty predictor, well, it's still an equally shitty predictor. It was never right more than 50% of the time. And when you also had another stimulus that was right 100% of the time, well, hell yeah, you're going to learn about the one that's right 100% of the time. You're not going to learn much about this one. But you learned a little bit about that one. And now, through the extinction trials, I have just trained you that that really good predictor you learned about is now no longer valid. It doesn't predict anything. We've extinguished that association. So, without getting any less shitty, this predictor is now the best one you have. A 50% predictor of an electric shock is still better than no prediction. So you start responding more to this CS. Even though it has never been presented, we're going to see, well, it has to be presented during test trials, of course, but even though we're not, incorporating the tone into our extinction process in any way, and it's not being paired with anything, we're going to start seeing the response to it get bigger. So this is kind of the key idea in the comparator model, is that you may have multiple possible predictors of an event. What really matters is which one is, what is the best predictor you've got. So you might have a really great predictor and a kind of shitty predictor right now. And so you're going to, the great predictor is the one you're going to pay attention to. But I extinguish that really good predictor. Now the shitty one is the best one you have. And that's the one you're going to start showing response to. Even though it hasn't got any better at predicting, it's now the best one you got. You got two cars sitting in your driveway. You got a Ferrari Testarossa 1978 Datsun V210. A car. I actually saw one driving around out here. I was amazed. I was pretty sure all those things had turned into piles of rust like 35 years ago. But I guess up here on the West Coast, you know, salt the roads, a couple of them have survived. Now, you want to go out driving around, you're going to go driving around in your Ferrari. Your Ferrari kicks ass. The other car's a piece of shit. You get pulled over for driving like an idiot and your Ferrari gets hauled off to the impound lot, and you still got to go buy groceries. What are you going to do? You're just going to sit home and cry? No, you're going to get in your shitty car and go get the groceries. Same kind of principle here. If you had a better car, you'd use it. But if your better car gets taken away, you're going to use your shitty car. Even though it's a much shittier car than the other one you had, it's now the best car you got. All right, well, that is as far as I'm going to go in terms of lecturing at you. So, at this point, well, here's an idea. This will make things diplomatically easier for some of you. Let's take our 10-minute break, and if you have nothing you want to talk to me about, you can extend that break right up until next Thursday night. If you do, if you've got something you want to ask me about, well, just give me 10 minutes to go adjust my neurochemistry, and then we will talk about whatever you wish to talk about. All right, sound fair?
Yep.
Yeah.
Did you say how the layout of the test is, or?
I'm not sure I could tell you a whole lot. Well,
You say like the quizzes?
experiments. And so I'm just going to run through basically how we would use this model to depict a blocking situation. So again, just to recover this base, this is what we're talking about in terms of basic preparation. So if we're going to do a full-blown blocking study here, we've got two groups, our experimental group, this being the one that's going to show us blocking, and then control group, and two phases. So now, we're not going to have to model each and every bit of every phase, as you'll see. We'll take a few logical shortcuts here. But again, in phase one, our experimental group gets one of the CSs paired with the US, presumably until that association is asymptotic. And then in phase two, both groups start getting the compound CS, CSA and CSB, paired with the US. And again, the basic idea is that while our control group, once we get to phase two, we'll now start learning about both associations, CSA US and CSB US. Our experimental group will never learn to associate CSB with the US. That association will be blocked, and we talked about why that would be the case in terms of contingency. If you already have a perfect predictor of shock, what benefit is there to you to learn another perfect predictor of shock? Well, one of the little wrinkles you have to deal with if you're going to model blocking is because when we get to the second phase of a blocking study, we're dealing with a compound CS. Two CSs presented together leading to the US. Now, we're dealing with compound stimulant model. There's no way to model a compound stimulus all at once. So we're going to have to break it down into the two separate CSs, model what happens with regard to each CS, and then, as we'll get to, then we have to do a little bit of adding things up at the end to make sure we kind of stay on track. So when we start phase two of modeling, for example, when we talk about our control group, we're going to have to model first, the associate, what's delta V for the CSA US association, and then we're going to have to model what's delta V for the CSB US association. And then, as I'll show you in the actual numbers in a second, we're going to have to add up both of those delta V's because they're both coming off of the same US. The same US is powering both associations. So when we get to the second trial, we're going to have to add up all the learning that's used up by either CS before we start modeling the second trial. that doesn't make any sense to you, well, hopefully it will shortly. So, we're not going to bother doing any modeling for phase 1. There's really no point. We can just sort of assume that in our experimental group, we ran those phase 1 trials until that association hit asymptote. So it was as strong as it was going to get. Now, as we talked about with regards to this model, there is that sort of Zeno's paradox element to it, that if we just kept calculating trial after trial after trial, we'd never actually get to the point where V sub t was exactly equal to lambda. It would just keep getting microscopically closer and closer. So this is a little bit of a fudge, but I think it's a justifiable fudge, that we're just going to assume that in the first phase for our experimental group, we used up all the available associative strength, that first association. So we're going to kind of assume that we got V sub t all the way up so it's actually equal to lambda, just to make things relatively simple. So we're just going to have to start plugging numbers in the model when we get to phase 2. So there's no a priori reason why I have to pick certain values here as long as I'm working within the limits. So I'm going to just decide to keep things as simple as I can here. I'm going to say that CSA and CSB are equally salient. So the light and the tone equal in terms of salience. And the shock, well, I'm just going to assign that a beta value of 0.5 and use alpha values of 0.2 for both of my CSs. And other than my decision that both CSs were equally salient, there's nothing else really governing what numbers I pick here. I could have picked 0.7 for both CSs. I could have picked 0.2 for beta. It really wouldn't matter. And I'm just going to arbitrarily pick a lambda value of 100. So here, again, we're going to model it as if both CSs were equally salient. Now, if they were not equally salient, that would not cause us a huge problem. What I'm going to sort of go through first is just modeling a couple trials of the control group. And that would look a little bit different if we use CSs of different salience, because we'd see the two CSs acquiring strength at different rates. But the overall point of the demonstration of blocking would not be affected by that. So we look at the first phase 2 trial. And again, this should look pretty much the same as the kind of acquisition stuff we ran through last week, with one little exception, one little thing we have to add to the procedure here because of the compound CS. So we plug the numbers in there, and for a control group, they end up acquiring 10 units of associative strength to CSA. So again, we're just modeling, let's say, the light here. So the light in the control group requires 10 units on the first trial, and then we got to model the second CS separately. So how much associative strength is CSB going to acquire? Well, given that the values for the two CSs are the same, somewhat unsurprised, I hope you're not surprised by this, the math works out exactly the same. So two equally salient CSs, they're going to be learned about at an equal rate, and your math should probably reflect that. So both